The bell rang, its sharp tones slicing through the early morning hum of chatter in the hallway. Students shuffled into Mrs. Bennett's advanced history class, their footsteps blending into the muffled clamor. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Bennett herself, a rigid figure with a stern gaze, a perfectly ironed blouse, and an air of unearned superiority. Her reputation preceded her, known for her harshness, especially towards students of color. Whispers about her thinly veiled biases circulated among the student body. But today, she wasn't prepared for who had walked into her classroom. Aaron Thompson, a brilliant and ambitious high school senior with dreams of studying law at an Ivy League school, took his seat in the middle row. His presence alone seemed to unsettle Mrs. Bennett. She glanced at him, her lips pressing into a thin line, as if calculating her next move. Without wasting a moment, Mrs. Bennett launched into her lecture, her tone dripping with condescension. "Let's begin," she said, her eyes darting briefly toward Aaron. "Today, we'll discuss the Revolutionary War, an era far removed from the narratives of victimhood some people cling to these days." Several students exchanged uncomfortable glances, some sinking deeper into their seats. Aaron sat upright, his sharp eyes locked on her, unflinching. The room's tension was palpable, though the day had only begun. It was clear this would be no ordinary history lesson. Mrs. Bennett's lecture began as expected, her voice clipped and authoritative as she scrawled dates and events on the chalkboard. But it wasn't long before her true colors began to seep through. "Let's test how well you're paying attention," she said, turning abruptly to face the class. Her gaze landed squarely on Aaron, who was already jotting notes with practiced precision. "Aaron," she said, her tone sharp, "why don't you tell us why the founding fathers' vision of liberty didn't apply to everyone?" The question seemed straightforward, but her emphasis on everyone carried a pointed edge. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the challenge beneath her words. Aaron, however, met her gaze without hesitation. "Certainly, Mrs. Bennett," he replied, his voice calm and steady. "The founding fathers' vision of liberty was limited by their own societal constructs, which excluded women, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans. Their pursuit of freedom was paradoxical, given their dependence on systems of oppression." The class murmured in quiet admiration, impressed by the clarity of his response. Mrs. Bennett, however, seemed less impressed. Her lips twitched as though she had tasted something bitter. She said, tapping her chalk against the desk. "A decent answer. But don't you think it's reductive to frame history through the lens of victimhood? Maybe if we spent less time dwelling on grievances, we could focus on what truly made this country great." The words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, choking the room with their implications. A few students widened their eyes in shock, while others stared at their desks, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Aaron's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "I don't believe acknowledging the truth is dwelling on grievances, Mrs. Bennett," Aaron replied, his tone unshaken. "Understanding the full context of history is essential if we're to appreciate the progress we've made and recognize where we still need to grow." Her face darkened, and for a moment, it seemed she might lash out. Instead, she turned back to the board with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Let's move on," she said curtly, though the tension in the room lingered. The class trudged on, but the atmosphere was thick with unease. Mrs. Bennett, though outwardly calm, began to orchestrate subtle digs aimed squarely at Aaron. Each question she posed seemed tailored to challenge him, each comment laced with veiled disdain. "Aaron," she called out again, this time after detailing the economic underpinnings of the American colonies. "Can you explain why the Southern economy relied so heavily on certain labor systems?" Her tone dripped with implication, the emphasis on labor systems leaving no room for misinterpretation. Aaron leaned back slightly, aware of her intentions but refusing to be rattled. "The Southern economy was deeply reliant on enslaved labor," he said, enunciating each word deliberately, "because it allowed plantation owners to amass wealth on the backs of unpaid workers. This exploitation was a cornerstone of the economy and one of the reasons systemic inequities persist even today." There was no mistaking the ripple of tension that moved through the room. A few students glanced at each other, some impressed by Erin's poise, others nervously waiting for Mrs. Bennet's reaction. Her smile was thin, almost brittle. "That's one perspective," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "But perhaps it's time we focus on the resilience and ingenuity of the colonists rather than perpetuating a narrative of oppression." Erin's pen hovered over his notebook, his fingers tightening around it. He could see what she was doing, trying to bait him, to diminish his voice. But he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of losing his cool. "History isn't about comfort, Mrs. Bennet," he said, his tone measured but firm. "It's about truth. Ignoring the darker parts doesn't make them disappear. It just ensures we'll repeat them." A few students nodded subtly, their silent support emboldening him. But Mrs. Bennet, visibly unsettled, pressed on. "Perhaps we'll come back to that idea later," she said abruptly, turning back to the chalkboard. "For now, let's focus on the achievements that define this era." It was a clear attempt to shift the narrative, to reassert her control over the discussion. But Erin wasn't done yet. He knew she wouldn't stop until she felt she'd silenced him completely. As the class continued, Mrs. Bennet's attempts to undermine Erin became more overt. She began to frame her questions in ways designed to corner him, subtly questioning his intelligence in front of the class. "Erin," she said again, this time after discussing the framing of the Constitution, "you seem to have strong opinions about historical injustices. So tell me, what do you think about the 3/5 compromise? Do you believe the Founding Fathers were all just racist villains?" Her question was a trap, framed to provoke an emotional response or force him into an oversimplified answer. The class went silent, all eyes on Erin as he considered his response. "That's an interesting question, Mrs. Bennet," Erin began, his voice calm but firm. The 3/5 compromise was a calculated political move, one that highlights the moral contradictions of the time. It wasn't about seeing black people as partial humans. It was about using their presence to bolster representation while denying them actual rights. To call them racist villains would be reductive. They were flawed individuals navigating a flawed system. But understanding their actions requires us to critically examine their motives, not gloss over them for the sake of comfort. The class was riveted. Erin's response was eloquent, precise, and impossible to dismiss. But Mrs. Bennet, rather than acknowledging his insight, gave a tight smile. "That's an opinion," she said curtly, "though I would argue that we shouldn't project modern sensibilities onto historical figures. It's unfair to judge them by today's standards." Erin's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he stayed composed. "I'm not projecting, Mrs. Bennet," he replied. "I'm simply analyzing their actions in the context of their time while recognizing their impact on today's society. History doesn't exist in a vacuum." The air in the room grew heavier. A few students, emboldened by Erin's courage, nodded subtly or exchanged approving glances. But Mrs. Bennet's irritation was becoming harder to mask. "Well," she said, her voice tight, "perhaps if we spent less time moralizing and more time appreciating the challenges they faced, we'd understand history better." Erin leaned forward slightly, his eyes steady. "Appreciation doesn't require ignoring the truth," he said. "If we can't confront the contradictions in our history, how can we truly learn from it?" Mrs. Bennet's face flushed, her grip on the chalk tightening. It was clear she wasn't used to being challenged this way, especially not by a student. The class trudged on, but the tension had reached a boiling point. Mrs. Bennet, visibly agitated, began steering the lecture in a new direction, one that felt oddly personal. She started referencing events and figures in ways that seemed designed to target Erin's identity and beliefs. "Let's talk about cultural contributions to history," she announced, her tone sharp and clipped. "Some groups, despite facing hardships, still managed to contribute positively to society. Take Booker T. Washington, for example, a man who focused on self-reliance and hard work rather than dwelling on oppression." She didn't look at Erin as she spoke, but her words were clearly aimed at him. The subtle dig was obvious to everyone in the room. Erin, however, remained calm, his pen moving steadily across his notebook as though her words couldn't touch him. "Erin," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence, Do you agree with Washington's philosophy? Or do you think he should have focused more on grievances? This time, there was no mistaking her intent. A few students exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. Aaron paused, setting his pen down carefully before meeting her gaze. I think Booker T. Washington's contributions were significant, Aaron said evenly. But they were part of a larger debate within the Black community. While Washington emphasized self-reliance, others, like W.E.B. Du Bois, argued for political activism and civil rights. Both approaches were necessary for progress, and dismissing one as grievance oversimplifies the struggle for equality. His response was met with an audible murmur of approval from the class. But Mrs. Bennet wasn't ready to let it go. Interesting, she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. But don't you think focusing too much on activism can create division rather than unity? Perhaps that's why Washington's approach was more productive. Aaron's jaw tightened, but his expression remained composed. Respectfully, Mrs. Bennet, he said, his voice steady. Washington's approach worked in his context, but activism is what drives systemic change. Without it, many of the rights we take for granted today wouldn't exist. Unity is important, but it shouldn't come at the cost of justice. The class was silent, the weight of Aaron's words hanging in the air. Mrs. Bennet's face reddened, and her smile grew tight. Well, she said briskly, perhaps you should consider that there are different perspectives on these issues. Not everything has to be about race. After all, the comment landed like a slap. A few students gasped softly, their shock evident. Aaron's expression didn't falter, but something shifted in his eyes, resolve hardening into steel. Mrs. Bennet, he said finally, his voice steady but firm, I find it curious that you'd suggest race doesn't need to be a factor in discussions about history. How do we address the truth of what happened without acknowledging the systems and prejudices that shaped it? His words were sharp, but his tone was respectful, a balance that made it impossible to accuse him of being confrontational. Mrs. Bennet blinked, caught off guard by his calm defiance. I'm just saying, she replied, her voice tinged with irritation, that constantly framing discussions around race can detract from the broader lessons of history. Sometimes focusing on unity rather than division might be more productive. Aaron tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Productive for whom? He asked. The question was simple, but its implications were anything but. A ripple of murmurs moved through the class. For the first time, several students began to shift in their seats, nodding in agreement with Aaron or casting skeptical glances at Mrs. Bennet. History isn't divisive. Mrs. Bennet, Aaron continued, it's only divisive when we refuse to tell the whole story. Unity doesn't come from ignoring the truth. It comes from confronting it and working toward understanding. A hand shot up from the back of the room. It was Elena, one of Aaron's classmates who rarely spoke in class. Aaron's right, she said, her voice hesitant but growing stronger. If we don't talk about what really happened, how are we supposed to learn? Ignoring stuff like racism doesn't make it go away. Another hand went up, then another. One by one, students began voicing their agreement, emboldened by Aaron's courage. Mrs. Bennet's eyes darted around the room, her carefully constructed authority beginning to crumble. All right, she said sharply, trying to regain control. Let's move on to the next topic. But the class wasn't ready to move on. Aaron had ignited something, a shift in the dynamic that Mrs. Bennet couldn't ignore. Actually, Mrs. Bennet, Aaron said, his voice unwavering, I think this discussion is important. If we're going to understand history, we need to include all perspectives, not just the ones that make us comfortable. The class murmured in agreement, and Mrs. Bennet's face flushed with frustration. She looked as though she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words.